Picture this, 50 degrees Celsius, not a single river in sight, no lake, no visible water for miles in any direction, just rock, sand, and heat that can kill a man in hours if he's not careful. This is a place built to punish anyone who stays too long. And yet, right here in the middle of this desert, an ancient civilization built one of the most advanced cities the world has ever seen. No trucks, no engines, no modern tools of any kind. No cranes, no explosives, no imported machinery. Just human hands, patience, and centuries of accumulated knowledge passed quietly from parent to child. This is Petra. And what you're about to hear is not the version they teach you in tourist brochures or squeeze into a 30-second highlight reel. Most videos about Petra show you the treasury facade, call it beautiful, and move on. That's the shallow version. That's the postcard version. The real question, the one that actually matters, is this. How did a desert tribe with no engineering degrees, no written manuals, no blueprints handed down from some lost empire, managed to outsmart nature itself and build a thriving city in a place that was practically designed to erase anyone foolish enough to settle there? Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how they pulled it off, how they turned a canyon into one of the richest cities on the planet, and exactly how it all came crashing down centuries later. And trust me, the ending is not what you expect. Let's rewind more than 2,000 years. Long before Rome ruled 3 continents, long before most of the great Mediterranean cities reached their peak, a nomadic Arab tribe called the Nabataeans wandered through what is now southern Jordan. They weren't always settled people. For generations, they lived the way desert tribes had always lived, moving with the seasons, following scattered water sources, trading in small amounts here and there, surviving on memory and oral knowledge rather than maps or written records. They knew the desert the way a sailor knows the sea, every subtle sign, every hidden path, every place where the ground held secrets other people couldn't see. Then, at some point, gradually rather than in one single dramatic moment, they stopped moving and settled into a narrow valley surrounded almost entirely by towering rock walls. On paper, this made zero sense. The land was dry. The rock was brutal, sharp, and unforgiving. Days were scorching hot and nights could drop cold enough to freeze exposed skin. There was no obvious reason to build a permanent city here rather than somewhere closer to the coast, somewhere with visible rivers, somewhere easier. But the Nabataeans saw something that everyone else completely missed: a hidden corridor. A narrow, winding passage now known to the world as the Sick, barely wide enough in places for 2 camels to pass side by side. Its walls rising so high on either side that sunlight only reaches the canyon floor for a few hours a day. And that corridor connected some of the most valuable trade routes on Earth, running from deep inside the Arabian Peninsula all the way up to the shores of the Mediterranean. What looked like a dead end was actually a fortress. What looked like nothing was actually everything. The surrounding cliffs hid the settlement almost completely from the outside world. Invading armies could march along nearby routes and never even know the city existed, tucked away behind stone walls that nature itself had built. Meanwhile, this so-called hidden location sat directly on top of one of the busiest, most profitable crossroads in the entire ancient trading world. Total protection on one hand, total access on the other. That rare, almost impossible combination is where Petra's entire story truly begins. But here's the problem nobody talks about when they show you those pretty photographs. Location alone doesn't build a city, water does. And in this region, rain might fall for a handful of days each year, sometimes less, sometimes barely at all for years at a stretch. When it did rain, it rarely came gently. It came violently, in sudden flash floods that could rip through a narrow canyon in minutes, sweeping away anything in their path with terrifying force. Most civilizations looking at this kind of environment would have concluded that permanent settlement simply wasn't possible, that this land was meant to be crossed, not lived in. The Nabataeans looked at the exact same problem and reached a completely different conclusion. They said, "We can fix this. And then they spent generations proving it. Using nothing but hand tools and centuries of trial and error, they carved an intricate network of channels directly into solid rock. Some of these channels were barely wider than a human hand, cut with extraordinary precision, angled just right to catch rainwater falling on distant mountains and guide it, gently, deliberately, down into the heart of the city. They built dams at critical points along the canyon to tame those violent flash floods instead of being destroyed by them, turning a natural disaster into a controlled resource. They carved hundreds of cisterns directly into the cliffs themselves, hidden from direct sunlight to slow evaporation, storing water carefully for the long, dry months that stretched out ahead. Some of these cisterns still hold water today, more than 1,000 years after the engineers who built them disappeared from history. This wasn't luck. This wasn't a lucky guess that happened to work. This was calculated, tested, refined generation after generation, adjusted and improved slowly over time until the entire system became sophisticated enough to support a population historians estimate may have reached into the tens of thousands at Petra's peak. Gardens grew in the middle of the desert. Agricultural terraces produced food where nothing should have grown. Public bathhouses filled with flowing water in a place that, by every natural law, should have had none at all. Travelers arriving after brutal stretches of desert crossing, dust-covered, exhausted, half convinced they'd imagined the whole city, would step through the sick and suddenly find fountains. Actual, functioning fountains. In the middle of nowhere. It must have felt less like arriving in a city and more like stepping into a mirage that refused to disappear. And once water stopped being the enemy, once survival was no longer a daily gamble, something enormous happened. Wealth. Massive, almost unbelievable wealth, the kind that took outsiders centuries to fully understand or appreciate. Here's the part most people don't realize about the Nabataeans. They weren't just surviving the desert. They were running one of the most quietly profitable operations anywhere in the ancient world. Frankincense and myrrh, harvested from trees in southern Arabia and across the narrow stretch of water into the Horn of Africa, moved through their hands in enormous quantities, destined for temples, wealthy households, and medicinal use across the Mediterranean. Silk drifted in a long route stretching all the way toward the east, passed from trader to trader over thousands of miles before ever reaching Nabataean territory. Spices, dyes, rare textiles, ivory, precious stones, all of it needed to pass through land the Nabataeans controlled on its way toward buyers in Rome, Egypt, and Greece. And the Nabataeans sat directly on top of the bottleneck, collecting from both directions. They charged tolls on every caravan that passed through their territory. They offered protection, guiding and guarding merchants through dangerous stretches of open desert in exchange for payment, functioning almost like ancient security contractors, safeguarding some of the most valuable cargo moving anywhere on the planet at that time. And they got rich doing it. Richer than most outsiders at the time ever fully realized. Because unlike empires that paraded their wealth openly in grand public squares and monuments visible from every direction, the Nabataeans tucked much of theirs away behind a narrow canyon that most travelers never even found, unless they already knew exactly where to look. But eventually, wealth like that has to show itself somewhere. And it did, carved directly into the cliffs surrounding the city, permanent and undeniable. Petra's most famous monuments weren't built from imported stone hauled in slowly on wagons over hundreds of miles. They were sculpted straight out of the surrounding sandstone, chiseled with a level of artistic detail and architectural sophistication that rivaled anything found in far wealthier, far more established parts of the Mediterranean world. This wasn't simple decoration. This was a message carved permanently into rock for anyone who made it through the sick to see. A message that said, "We are not desert wanderers scraping by on the margins. We are a power in our own right, and you should treat us like one." Rome got the message. For decades, Rome watched from a distance as the Nabataean Kingdom grew wealthier, more organized, and more influential, sitting directly on top of trade routes that Rome desperately wanted greater control over for itself. At first, Rome's approach was largely diplomatic. Trade agreements were negotiated. Alliances were formed. There were long stretches where the relationship functioned almost like an uneasy partnership, with both sides quietly profiting from stable, predictable trade flowing through Nabataean territory. Roman officials visited. Nabataean kings sent gifts, negotiated terms, and carefully balanced independence against the risk of provoking their far larger, far more powerful neighbor. But empires as ambitious and far-reaching as Rome rarely stay patient forever, especially when the prize sitting just beyond their direct control is this valuable. Slowly, diplomacy began giving way to something closer to pressure. Rome started asserting more direct influence over the region, adjusting trade arrangements to favor Roman interests, positioning legions closer to Nabataean territory, tightening its grip step by step around a kingdom that had once operated with real independence. In the early 2nd century, this slow tightening finally culminated in full annexation. Rome formally absorbed the Nabataean Kingdom, folding what had once been an independent trading power into the Roman province of Arabia. There was no single dramatic battle here, no cinematic siege of the kind you'd see dramatized in a movie. It was slower than that, quieter than that. A kingdom absorbed piece by piece, treaty by treaty, until one day its independence simply stopped existing, with remarkably little bloodshed compared to how Rome typically expanded elsewhere. For a while after this transition, Petra actually adapted reasonably well to its new circumstances. Roman architectural styles began blending with traditional Nabataean design throughout the city, creating a distinctive hybrid look still clearly visible in the ruins today. Columns and facades that are neither fully Roman nor fully Nabataean, but something uniquely their own. Roads connecting Petra to the wider Roman world were expanded and improved. Trade kept moving through the city, even under new management, even with Roman officials now collecting what Nabataean kings once collected themselves. For a moment, it looked like the city might simply continue thriving indefinitely, just operating under a different flag. But here's the twist that ended up mattering more than the Roman takeover itself, and it's the part almost nobody brings up when they tell this story. Petra's real power was never actually about who ruled it politically. It was about controlling trade, and that control was already slipping away quietly in the background, even while the city still looked prosperous on the surface. As Roman influence expanded across the wider region, sea routes across the Mediterranean and the Red Sea became faster, safer, and far more efficient than they had ever been before. Ships could carry significantly larger loads than camel caravans ever could, and they could bypass the deserts of Arabia entirely, cutting out the tolls, the risks, and the delays that came with overland desert travel. Slowly, gradually, almost invisibly at first, the caravans that had once flooded Petra with seemingly endless wealth began to thin out. The tolls dried up. The trading profits shrank year after year, and the city that had built its entire identity, its entire economy, around being the essential middleman of the ancient world suddenly found itself with less and less to actually be the middleman of. Then came the moment that changed everything, the moment that turned a slow decline into something far more permanent. In the 4th century, a massive earthquake tore through the region, and its consequences went far beyond simple property damage. It devastated Petra, and it destroyed something far more critical to the city's survival than any single building. It shattered the water systems. The same intricate channels, the same carefully placed cisterns, the same dams that had taken generations upon generations to design and perfect. The very engineering that had made a desert city possible in the first place were suddenly cracked, broken, and compromised, right at the exact moment when Petra no longer had the trade wealth necessary to fund major repairs. No trade income flowing in like before, No fully functional water infrastructure to rely on. No easy way to bounce back the way the city might have during its wealthier, more prosperous centuries. The population began to shrink. Buildings that had once been carefully maintained slowly fell into disrepair, cracked facades left unrepaired, streets once bustling with merchants growing quiet. What was once a roaring desert capital, filled with traders from distant lands, skilled artisans and wealthy merchant families, faded gradually into something closer to a ghost of its former self. Over the centuries that followed, Petra slipped almost entirely out of the wider world's memory, its name fading from the trade ledgers and travel accounts that had once mentioned it constantly, known mainly now to local Bedouin tribes who lived quietly around its ruins, protecting a secret the rest of the world had, quite literally, forgotten even existed. It stayed that way, hidden, silent, and largely unknown to outsiders, for well over 1,000 years. Then, in the early 19th century, a European explorer, guided carefully by local Bedouins who had watched over the site and kept its location close for generations, finally made his way through the narrow sick and laid eyes on the abandoned city. And what he found left him completely speechless. An entire city, still standing after more than 1,000 years of near-total abandonment, carved directly into stone, waiting patiently in complete silence for someone from the outside world to remember it existed at all. A place that had once controlled the flow of some of the most valuable trade goods on the planet, brought down not by weakness, not by any lack of genius or engineering skill, but by a combination of shifting global trade routes, slow political absorption into a larger empire, and one devastating earthquake that struck at exactly the wrong moment in the city's history. Petra survived the desert itself for centuries. What it couldn't survive was being forgotten, first by trade, then by empire, and finally, in the most literal sense, by the earth beneath it. And that's really the story here, the full story, the one that rarely makes it past the highlight reel. A civilization with no modern technology, no advanced machinery, and no outside help managed to outsmart one of the harshest environments on the entire planet. They engineered water out of almost nothing, turning brief seasonal rainfall into a permanent, reliable supply that sustained tens of thousands of people. They built staggering, generational wealth out of a narrow mountain passage that most outsiders would have written off as useless. They stood eye to eye, for a time, with the single most powerful empire in the ancient world, and held their own long enough to leave a permanent mark on history. And when it all finally fell apart, it wasn't because the Nabataeans failed or lacked the brilliance that had carried them this far. It was because the world around them changed faster than any city, no matter how ingeniously built, could possibly keep pace with. 2,000 years later, Petra is still standing, carved permanently into rock, weathered but unbroken, still whispering the same message the Nabataeans built it to send in the very first place. We were here, and despite everything this desert threw at us, we were never as small as it made us look.